Welcome. My name is Lucan, professor of political science at the University of Toronto at the Center for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, and I'm co-director of the Petro Jacyk program for the study of Ukraine. Welcome to this panel on Russia's war against Ukraine. Today we are joined by a number of experts. Volodymyr Dubovyk is coming at us from Western Ukraine. He's a professor, associate professor in the Department of International Relations and director of the Center for International Relations at the Mechnykov National University in Odessa. We also have Marta Dyczok, who is associate professor of history and political science at Western University. Olga Onuch, who's a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester. Oxana Shevel, who's associate professor of political science at Tufts University. And Tatiana Zhurzhenko, research fellow at the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin. So we're just going to start it off here. We have only an hour, and I'm sure there's a lot to talk about it. Volodymyr, I'm just going to throw it to you. Can you just tell us what the current situation is and what your impressions are?
Well, the current situation is tense, obviously. Now we know the answer to the question we had for months. What is Putin doing? Is he preparing for the war, or is he actually engaging in a diplomacy effort? We now know that diplomacy, security proposals was all small screen, so he was getting ready for the war. Many documents have been captured, which prove that for months they've been deliberately planning their war attempt. And that's why many demands that Russia put forward were completely unrealistic. Just use it for prepare, use for the time, gather forces, and so on. So what is this war? It's an all-out war, of course, as we can see, aimed at destruction of the Ukrainian nationhood. It's an existential moment for Ukrainian nation state. He probably is trying to eliminate Ukraine from political map. So it's far from being a limited incursion. Would he try occupation of Ukraine? Then what part of it? Entire Ukraine, or half of Ukraine, or something? Would he be okay with division of Ukraine? Would he actually install puppet government? All those questions are still up in the air. He might. The Russian war is dead, though. It's interesting because they've been using soft power on Ukraine for years. And now it's just a military force. In 2014, he moved at the expense of soft power to using hard power, but now it's just 100% hard power. And as you can see, Russian attacks are primarily in the pro-Russian regions right now in the east and south. So I'm not even sure if there will be a sizable fifth column, which would be instrumental for occupation, because right now the people under the bombs are also the people who used to be friendly to Russia in many ways. What is going on right now, of course, is not just limited to military strikes at military objects, installations, but it's really a Grozny or Aleppo style attacks. It's inflicting maximum of pain on civilians, increasing suffering to use it as a leverage to force concessions. That's why you see hits at kindergarten, schools, universities, railway stations, and so on. And of course, it's a humanitarian disaster, part of the plan. You already have over 1 million of Ukrainians, passing the border to Central Eastern Europe, and that's just a start, because there'll be more, much more than just 1 million. The war doesn't proceed according to his plan. He talked to Macron today, and he said that everything's fine according to the plan, and they have more forces. That's not true. It's a huge delay in their plan. They are not meeting their required, objectives. There is nothing for them to throw on Ukraine anymore. They basically have used all this grouping of forces that have accumulated around our borders. Ukrainian resolve was severely underestimated in Kremlin for a number of reasons. We can go into it if we have time in our discussion. So the results are not uneven. Of course, there are many advances here and there. The bad case is Kherson, but also I would argue against overhyping about losing Kherson. Is not the end of the war. In just one town, it's very unfortunate what's going on there. You hear about people taking hostages. You hear about mining the streets and so on. So Kherson, it's a bad case. Obviously, but it's not the end of the war. No, Russians having substantial losses. The Belarus factor is still not clear how it's going to play. Obviously, it's a new front for us. That's very bad, where our forces are stretched. What is also important to underline here and stress out is Ukraine is not a failed state at all. On the contrary, we're seeing consolidation. Everyone is working. President is addressing his nation from Kiev, not leaving. He said to his American friends that he doesn't want a right. He needs ammunition. He's staying in Kiev. So the resilience at its most, not just the government. Everyone's doing their job. Putin thought Ukraine would probably doesn't stand a chance without Washington's direct support, since the Kiev regime was a puppet and gonna just fall at the seams, and that didn't happen. Odessa, of course, is it's just been spared so far for some reason. Scared of landing, yes. There've been plans another day today when we expected a landing of Russian forces from the seaside. Didn't happen. But we'll see what's going on. It's tense there. Even the third country's commercial vessels being hit. Two today. One's been sank by Russian military battleships. The international support is growing. This is great. It's not only it can just force Putin to stop. Maybe not quickly, not right now. But it's isolating Russia, making it a pariah state. So it's very good. Help is coming from a number of particular countries, including Canada, which is really great. It's 24/7 non-stop flow of weapons across the border, so that's good too. So what is next? Finally, negotiations took place another round today. No particular announcements about the results, but no one is expecting much. I think the maximum would be some humanitarian corridors for people from outside of Kharkiv and other places, but even that might not happen. The positions are really diverse. Putin still thinks that he might win this outright by knockout. And the mood in Ukraine is quite different. Sociological polls show that military is still ready to fight. Each new day shows more brutality by occupation forces, but increases chances of Ukraine forces not to lose this fight overall. So Russia is lacking confidence now. There's people joining armed forces here in Ukraine, weapons coming in, immigration is ongoing. It's easier to fight, of course, when you don't have civilians behind your backs. So that being said, situation is extremely tense. It's an all-out war. The whole country feels it. The sirens are wailing across the entire country. No one is immune. The first morning of the war showed it. There've been many military installations being hit by Russian missiles, even in Western Ukraine, for instance, miles and miles, hundreds of miles away from Russian border. So of course they have a capability to reach whatever installations and they would like to hit. But Ukraine is not broken, and Ukraine is ready to continue fight. And there's no talk about capitulation. There's no talk about giving up on our fight. There'll be more victims, but Ukrainians haven't crossed that line, and I don't think they will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. Tatiana, could you talk a little bit more? Volodymyr alluded to this, but about the sort of current humanitarian situation in Ukraine right now? I think you're muted.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm myself, I'm from Kharkiv, from Eastern Ukraine. And of course, these days I was very much like in touch with my friends and relatives, and what's going on in Kharkiv right now is particularly dramatic. I think people were kind of trapped in the city because of the continuous shellings. I think it's already like third day that people cannot really go to bed and sleep more than 2 hours because they have to run to cellars if they have cellars. Yeah. So this, in the beginning, I think they were hiding in the underground in the metro, but if it goes on like again and again and again every 2 hours, you cannot like go to the underground all the time. Yeah, and people are, I think, emotionally exhausted, physically exhausted. They don't get enough sleep, and so it's very, I think. And today it was the day when I heard from many friends that they tried to leave the city, or some were already on the way, and most people went to Poltava because this seemed to be like the safest corridor. And Poltava is not affected yet, so it's a kind of calm place, and people at least what I heard, they hoped at least to sleep one night. Yeah, yeah. So it's actually very shocking what's going on there, and seeing like 1.5 million city of 1.5 million population in being shelled, being hit by missiles on this scale, like looks like Stalingrad. So it's kind of, yeah. What should I say? At the same time, I think, and this echoes what Volodymyr said, I think there is some incredible resilience actually on the ground, and the local authorities are working in an effective way. Also the army, the volunteers, the rescue teams, and the fire brigades. So everybody is doing their job. Also the medics, and so it's actually looks quite good, and one could be proud of this. But of course, the question is what comes next. Yeah, and so there are now talks about this green corridors, and so some people speculate that this is like Syria-like war. So they want cities, empty cities of civilians, and then just another thought was that they would create this kind of TV picture for the Russian audience, civilians fleeing from Nazis bombing their cities, and people would say, you see these fascists. Yeah, so to create a narrative as we saw it in Donbass, and yeah, and unfortunately there will be enough people in Russia buying this, yeah, that Kyiv did it to their citizens. So what will happen next? I don't know, because I think there are many people in Kharkiv also, like from the local civil society, who are going to resist, who are going to stay. They are not going to leave the city. And yeah, so we also saw it like in Kherson, we saw it in Melitopol, in Kupiansk, in Kharkiv Oblast. So people are actually very angry. They go to the streets, they go with the Ukrainian flags, and they actually are very angry and shout at the Russian military. And so if it turns like more violent, if people maybe start like partisan, like warfare, it can be very bloody, because then civilians will be also treated differently by Russians. So now I think in direct contact, Russians try to avoid escalation, but it might change. I think it can change every day if they feel like there is some kind of violence from below, some kind of partisan-like resistance. So what will happen then? I don't know. Repressions, taking hostages, shooting people. Actually, yeah, it's quite awful.
Great. Thank you, Tatiana. So next, I want to Olga, Onuch, you've done a lot of work on sort of different forms of resistance, popular resistance, and popular mobilization. I mean, I think one of the things that's impressed the entire globe is just how quickly Ukraine sort of went from a situation in which, initially before the invasion, Zelensky was actually encouraging people, to kind of de-escalate the situation and saying that Russia would not invade. But once it did invade, I mean, just the amount of mobilization of resistance, into what has sometimes, I think, sort of been called the sort of 40 million army, which I think looks, very appropriate to me. I'm just wondering if you have any, could sort of talk to us about sort of how they mobilize this resistance and sort of, the state of Ukrainian public opinion.
Yeah, so I think as our audience members in Toronto and those who come to Munk events will surely know Ukrainians have a long history of engagement, mobilization, and, you know, over the last few years, all I've been asked about up until this sad time is the protest nation, the protest nation, the protest nation. And certainly there's something about what Ukrainians have been able to do. And it's not just since independence. Certainly since independence, there have been multiple mass mobilizations and civic organizations and volunteerism and so on. But I think because of that history that predates independence, that actually goes back to the 60s, if not earlier, of self-organization, samoorganizatsiya, volunteerism, and using informal network ties. Now, we used to jokingly call this Baba Babi Skazala, the Ukrainian BBC, the woman told the other woman. But there is a truth to this for those of us who study social science. We actually have seen that informal network ties in Ukraine have been a great deal stronger than in some of the other countries in the region. So what we do know is that very quickly Ukrainians knew exactly who to turn to. They could reactivate some of their even Maidan era neighborhood networks. Our neighbors in Kyiv, they not only called us to make sure we were okay, which was something special, but they also contacted every single person in the building and their extended family within the first hour, right? And this doesn't surprise anyone who knows Ukrainians, right? And Volodymyr can tell us more about this. In Odessa as well, people were organizing a variety of different volunteer events, making Molotov cocktails and the like. Now, the question is, we know that these things are tied to two elements that we've studied over the years in Ukraine. First and foremost, Ukrainians, regardless of the language they speak, their ethnic background, or the region that they live in, actually have a very strong civic identity and attachment to the state. And specifically, Volodymyr Kulik, also Graham Robertson and Grigor Popelikish, Elise Giuliano, and others have written about this exactly, right? And that is something that is most likely to motivate this early volunteerism and mobilization. And certainly the first rise to the activation of people in the streets and joining the army and volunteering. The question is, how sustainable is this over time? There was first the shock, then there was the action. And now people are psychologically traumatized, tired, and also physically tired. And the question is, will this be able to continue? My sense is yes. My sense is that this will be a protracted war. And that is because of a number of miscalculations by the Russians, not least the fact that they decided to go with paratroopers who might look big and brawny and capable, but actually aren't when it comes to military tactics. And their troop to task ratio on the ground is just not sufficient to sustain, even if 25% of the activation of Ukrainians today is sustained over time, their troop to task ratio is not possible to quell that.
Great, thank you. So Oxana, do you want to speak to this question about,
yes, because I think that's what, just following what Olga was saying, I think it brings us to the question, sort of what's the end game there, right? Like, what are the likely possibilities? Like, what is it all about? I think I'm personally quite disheartened whenever I hear these talks in the West among people who are not Ukraine experts, this about some sort of off-ramp and some sort of like, pacification with Putin and making some kind of deal whereby, yes, maybe he gets something like his quote unquote security concerns and things more or less go back to normal. I think that's completely unrealistic and delusional to think this. I think what we're really looking at, the two most realistic possibilities, is either Putin wins by essentially scorched earth tactics all over Ukrainian cities, which would produce, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of deaths, tens of thousands of refugees, and the world would have to sort of live with the fact of letting that happen. I mean, as a previous speaker said, I think it's very unrealistic for Putin to expect to achieve this. We're now in the 7th day of this war. They captured one oblast, right? I mean, and even, as Volodymyr is saying, the actual de facto control of Kherson, it's not the same as just to roll your tanks in. But this is a country of 44 million people, right, with 20 some oblasts, right? Like they just don't have the manpower given the resistance they're facing and the all, logistical difficulties they're having and all the, help Ukraine is getting, including militarily and even manpower. There are people mobilizing to fight, not just Ukrainians who are currently abroad, but also, foreign citizens. They're not fighting on behalf of their country, right? But they're fighting, would come as individuals. So I think, as Olga said, protracted war is likely. And I think another possibility is that Putin loses. I mean, the way I see it, the end game of this, these are the two options. There is no sort of middle way there because he made his objectives very clear. He wants to destroy Ukrainian sovereignty. He wants to control the whole country. It's not about Donbass. It's not about some sort of NATO guarantee. It never was to begin with. I mean, I think we should be very clear-eyed about it. And for that, I would add, I think we should be, we're very early in this conflict. And I think just to assume that things in Russia won't change and he will remain in control, I think it's a little bit premature for that because the sanctions that have been imposed were massive. Putin came to power promising stability and prosperity. He already is undoing that in a week. There is talk now in various media that tomorrow they might declare martial law, right? We don't know, I guess, exactly because it was such a closed regime, what exactly are the sentiments within the elite, right? Like what would the oligarchs do? If people are fleeing, right, like as more people are getting, I'm not in any delusion that some sort of popular protest would topple him, but to assume that sort of Russian society won't be an actor in some important way, I think that's also a little bit premature. So as far as realistic outcomes, I think these are the two realistic outcomes. He essentially would create Aleppo in the heart of Europe, and Europeans would have to deal with it. And we had seen this pattern that the aid for Ukraine and the kind of measures taken, and change in German foreign policy, sort of things that seem impossible became, possible. And I certainly hope, as Zelensky was saying today, if you're not going to close the airspace because you fear confrontation with Russia, and that's sort of separate point to discussion. I don't think at this point anybody could be assumed to know what would trigger Putin, right? If the goal is to avoid nuclear escalation, I don't think we know really what's in his mind and what would trigger it. But okay, so if not closing the sky, at least provide the airplanes, right? Like, is that so? I think Ukraine has actually a pretty good chance, given what we've seen so far, of beating this actually at tremendous cost, sadly. And I think we should be watching what's happening in Russia. So I think this assumption that he's sort of fully in control there and nothing is going to change, to my mind, that's a little bit early to say. I think things will happen there as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I've been heartened by the number of protests in Russia against the war. And I think it's worthwhile for those watching this to sort of put these protests in context, given the cost to these individuals of going on the street and the repressiveness of the government. It's one thing to sort of protest in Toronto. It's quite another, and to protest in Moscow against the war in terms of, about your physical.
And I think it's also, I think it's sort of moving, like several moving pieces at once, right? Like the worse the war goes there, the more casualties they have, right? The more sort of this information filters out. Because I think, now protests have been pretty small. It's a country of 170 million. You're right, like whoever came out are brave people, but that's not sort of nearly enough size to make a difference, right? But I think, if say when Grozny was bombed, right, these Chechens were not sort of like dark-skinned Chechens, right? They were not us, right? Like when Aleppo was bombed, these were some like faraway Syrians. When you're now like your babushka in Kharkiv is getting bombed, like that's a different story, right? Again, I think people are kind of still in denial. Propaganda is still strong, but the more sort of that becomes known, I think there will be multiple processes. We could expect multiple processes within Russian society that might produce the consequences we're not even thinking about today.
That's right. I think, one of the interesting differences, I think the sort of, think of Grozny or Syria. This Ukraine is different both in terms of its size, its intimate connection to Russia. These are sort of people where people's grandmothers live, but it's also a place that has, a tremendous media presence in a way that, was not the case in Syria or Chechnya. So this is, the thought of, the thought that sort of Putin could hide this from the Russian public seems delusional, in my opinion. So maybe we could just move on to sort of, Marta, if you could sort of talk to us, we saw these pictures of the television tower being bombed. And do you have a sense of like where media is right now in Ukraine and sort of, are people, is there still television? Volodymyr could answer this as well. Is television still?
That's a really good question, because it seems like when everything's being bombed, what's happening in the information sphere? And the short answer is yes, there's still a lot of media in Ukraine. And as we all know, information has been one of the battlegrounds starting in 2013-14, and it continues to be today. So the control of information, the construction of narratives, information warfare, disinformation, this has been a large part of what's been happening for years and years. And I think when we're looking at the information side of it, there's three dimensions. There's international, Ukrainian, and Russian. And so the international dimension, what I see, which is very interesting, is there's been a real shift in the media narratives. It used to be the Ukraine crisis, and now it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that's significant, but I think that's a different topic. The other thing that's interesting to watch is what's happening within Russia. And that touches on what Oxana and Olga and others have been saying, that to what degree is Russian public opinion informed? And you know that Putin has been clamping down even further on media in Russia. The key here is what's going on in Ukraine. How informed are Ukrainians? And they, as you know, are working in horrific conditions. But journalists and media in general, they see themselves as information warriors. And what has happened even before the actual war started is this move towards unity. And there was a unity TV marathon on the 22nd of February, where all the TV channels and radio channels got together and had this unity telemarathon. Once the war actually started, a lot of TV and radio stations are getting cut off the air in various times in various places. But what they are showing, which is kind of surprising because most media is commercial, unity. And I'm going to share my screen here and show you Olga Hirasanyuk. She is the head of the National TV and Radio Broadcasting thing. And this is, there's a coalition of all of these commercial TV stations plus the public broadcaster. And what they do is what happens, I don't know if you can actually hear my speak, but you can just go to her page and see it yourself. But what they're doing is they're saying, if you can't catch this channel, this is how. So they've unified their signals. So they're all kind of bouncing off each other. And also they're doing the same thing with radio. So they are seeing themselves as information warriors and doing their best, but it's also important to remember how difficult their conditions are. The group that I'm most in touch with is Hromadske Radio, who some of you know I've been working with for a long time. And they were just describing how they are now pretty much working out of their apartments and basements and dachas, because their radio station is headquartered on Hrystatik 26, the main radio station in Ukraine. And that's right next to the post office. And what happened over the weekend, it was a curfew. So they couldn't go to work. So they figured out how to set up all of their connections and the sound engineer and the journalists and all of that. And they continued because they're also doing these information marathons. So they're constantly providing content on the air. Some of their journalists have had to leave Kyiv altogether because they have small children, so they're afraid of the shelling, so their staff is minimal. But they continue to broadcast. And some of their transmission towers in the east have been bombed, so they are also switching. And Radio Ukraine, Radio Ukraine, the public broadcaster, they have today actually put up information on their website saying, if the signal goes down, if the FM signal goes down, here are AM signals that you can switch to. And they're constantly providing information for people how to listen and watch where and working together. I mean, I don't know, Volodymyr, if you can confirm how consistent the actual signals are, but I was talking with Andrei Kulakov, who was actually in Munk the other day, and he was on air when the tower was hit. And so as he was broadcasting, the signal got interrupted. But what happened is somebody somewhere else, like one of their team members, picked up the signal and continued the broadcast until they were able to restore the one that they were on. So that is, I think, very similar to what we're seeing in the rest of Ukraine. The people are standing up, helping each other, working together, and they're pretty exhausted. So if you watch the TV shows, you can see the presenters looking, we're looking a little haggard, and here we are in our comfortable offices in North America, but they are doing a really, really good job. So just to plug, a lot of these independent media outlets are continuing to fundraise. So I think there's these lists of people saying, where do you want to donate? So Kyiv Independent is doing the best job. I think they're on a lot of lists. Hromadski International, I'd be happy to provide a list of places if you want to support media in Ukraine, in addition to the army and the humanitarian efforts.
Thank you. Volodymyr, can you speak to this? And
Yes, just briefly, yes, we have media coverage, and it's a good one. Actually, all major Ukrainian TV channels have merged in a general project, and they are kind of coming out on the air. And it's not one particular channel, but it's few, and they're just rotating each other, and they're doing a great job. Sometimes sitting in the bunker as well in Kyiv, and broadcasting from Kyiv. And of course, Russians understand the importance of this kind of information fight. And that's why they struck recently, what was yesterday? Yes, it seems like, every day is like a month. They struck the TV tower in Kyiv, and the signal was lost on many regions, but they've still managed to relay it. For instance, here in Odessa, Suspilne Odessa managing to continue to broadcast with this nationwide marathon. So that's a news marathon. So that's really good. They understand entirely, the occupiers, so the importance of this. For instance, in Kherson, one of the first things they went for the TV tower, we're now hearing, and they're trying to use the Suspilne Kherson now to broadcast their messages. And with all sorts of fakes, because of course we've been warned that there will be many fakes, including like Ukraine surrendered and so on, and Zelensky is not the president anymore. And we just got a news from, I think his advisor from Office of President Zelensky, Mr. Podolyak, that there were apparently some modest results of these negotiations, and there will be some perhaps humanitarian convoys allowed from certain cities, but he says no one knows for sure until the third round where, when, which cities, and how many people will be allowed to go and where. But at least it was just announced minutes ago that there will probably be some humanitarian convoys, but there is no trust at all to the Russians. With military, we still remember Ilovaisk, so right now they're even more brutal comparing to the times of Ilovaisk. So who would believe them? If they've shot at Ukrainian military at that point of time back then, at Ilovaisk, they can shoot easily at Ukrainian civilians evacuating certain cities. And I'm afraid that a lot of people would be judging, like in Kharkiv, in Sumy, other places, they'll be thinking for themselves, should they stay here under the bombardment, or should they try and get away through this humanitarian convoy, whether Russia will actually guarantee their safety? And it's an awful dilemma, and it's too hard.
and can you speak to the question?
Can I just jump in, because I forgot to say one thing. Zelensky is becoming, or has become, an international star. And someone like me who was quite skeptical of his political ability, the fact that he is a TV personality has been one of the big strengths here, because he knows exactly how to speak to the camera, how to reach his audience, how to frame his message. He's got a lot of good people with him, and appealing to the Jewish world after Babin Yar, and having, written in that language. He's just getting it right every single time, which I think is such a powerful tool in the information arsenal, because he's speaking to Ukrainians and the world in ways that is really resonating.
Absolutely. He's grown into the wartime leader, that's for sure. He's made tons of mistakes. I've never been a fan. I think a lot of mistakes been done in recent months. For instance, ignoring all messages coming from Washington that Russia is preparing for invasion, and basically saying, why would they aggravate the whole situation in Washington, instead of listening to Americans who were basically saying what they were seeing and better prepare for the aggression. But right now, of course, he fits really well. His charisma, he connects with the people. He's there. He's not leaving. Everyone is rallying around the flag, and that's very important. And his ratings up to the sky. And when he says we're not going to give up, it gives people hope, and vice versa. I mean, people basically convey some of their hopes and their energy and their lack of readiness to surrender to him. So it's really a very strong merge right now, a bridge between the rest of society and the leadership.
Yeah, thanks. So just wanted to speak briefly about the kind of the information war. And my sense is that Ukraine so far, at least on the global scale, has international level, has won the information war. And I wonder to what extent, President Biden in the United States deserves at least partial credit because he was so aggressive in sort of showing, the intelligence around Russia's plans. Because when I think about it, I could have imagined this going very differently, where there was, Biden had not done that, and there was some ambiguity about how the war was started or something like that. And so you might have imagined in that context, the sort of international reaction to be much more muted. Whereas now it's really clear. I mean, no one, outside of insane allies of Putin, really question whose fault the war is. I mean, I wonder what other people think about that.
Lucan, if I can, I'd like to jump in and also pick up on some of the things that were just said. I think media presence here is really important, and the public visibility of everyone involved is very important. And I just want to, two things. Yes, it was a particular tactic of the Biden administration, and actually insiders in the Biden administration have told me that they were doing this on purpose because they knew that it was near impossible to actually stop Putin should he truly be willing to do this, right? That there was very little that could be done. And from what I understand, Western allies were very much coordinated, and their staggered approach of constant visits was a way to drag out that period of time in order to ensure that Ukraine was in fact prepared. So here I want to just, Volodymyr, I disagree with you slightly. I don't think Zelensky was actively not doing. I think he was trying to keep the population calm because there was very little that he could do if that threat was real in the way that I think some believed. Also, there's a more complicated story there, but I think you're very right that it became near impossible, at least for Western eyes, to think that the cause of aggression comes from some other reason, right? But what here is important, I think, also on the media front, Russians are panicking in this regard. So I know from a person that just returned from Russia just a few days ago, last flight out, and they informed me that they actually had press releases and shows ready to go for February 26th because they so believed that their actions were going to be successful in 2 days, right? So they had all this media that was ready to go, and they were going to feed it to people, even the independent media outlets. And of course, what they had to do, they had to crack down on all social media, independent media outlets, and Dost was closed today. And what did they do for their perhaps hopefully not swan song? They actually showed Swan Lake as their last thing that they showed on television. Now, no one in Russia will miss the significance of that, right? And lastly, on the media front that I think we didn't mention yet is what's interesting in this particular war is the role of social media in a very different way. There are multiple social media sites. You can't just attack one and cut the information, right? Whether you're in Russia or you're in Ukraine, you have to then attack all of them. And what is, I think, most interesting that we've seen, it's not actually the politicians' speeches or the main media, it's the fact that all local villages and towns have their own telegrams and or WhatsApp groups and or Signal groups and or Facebook groups, sometimes multiple places. So if one is not accessible, then they can turn to another. And I found that to be particularly interesting. And we're trying to track and trace actually these Telegram groups right now. And they're for us as researchers, even when we beg to get in, they're not letting us in because they are keeping the security of those channels so controlled. I think that's fascinating.
And thank you, Olga. So I just want to ask some of the questions from the viewers. I think I can sort of guess the answer to this one, but I'll ask it nonetheless. Lawrence Franklin asks, is there any scenario in which permit the speedy resolution of the conflict while allowing all of the parties to save face?
Maybe I'll speak to that because I was actually just wanted to add, and my short answer, unfortunately, to this is no. And I think to understand this, you have to really, I think everybody, of course, naturally wants a diplomatic solution, right? And it seems like, how can you possibly not find something to agree with, right? I think we should be very clear-eyed about what it is that Putin wants, right? Ola mentioned that this victory speech, right? And that is a chilling document. They published it in one of the Russian media websites on the 26th, which was supposed to be the fall of Kiev, right? The 2 days. It is the solution, quote unquote, of the Ukrainian question, right? Just taking the language. His denazification, right? What does it mean exactly? That essentially means elimination of anybody who does not agree with Putin's view on history, on Ukraine's right to exist. We're not talking about some like Azov battalion or whichever other sort of neo-Nazi groups in there. Anybody, those of us who work on Ukraine, those of us who study Stalinist period, who study Soviet repression, civil society activists, everybody is subject to this so-called denazification, right? And I think we should be very clear-eyed about it. If you look at the British intelligence reports from before the invasion, there are plans for concentration camps. That's not fantasy. That's exactly what he intends to do. So he wants to take all over Ukraine. He wants to destroy sovereignty, and he wants to imprison or kill, and he's prepared to do it anybody who does not agree with him, right? Which would be millions of people. So I think this, sadly, again, to me, like it means that some kind of diplomatic solution that he would like take Donbass, or there would be some, neutral status. Like, no, like think about what denazification means. That's what he says he wants to do, right, in Ukraine. So unfortunately, I think that's, I don't think we are really in a place where that sort of, as the questioner was asking, that saves face for everybody. I just don't see that.
Yeah, no, there was a report coming out that they've planned public executions in territories they control. I mean, it almost seems like from another century or something. I mean, it's really, so how you negotiate with that seems unimaginable to me. So Professor Frank Sisson has a question which sort of speaks to this. Do you not think that Putin still has plans for uprooting the disease of Ukrainian nationalism, and the destruction of Lviv is possible as a way to solve this problem? I mean, indeed, I just want to, it's funny because as a scholar, I typically sort of, am reluctant to use the word genocide because I think it's sometimes overused. But in this case, I mean, given Putin's speech, on February 21st, I mean, this seems really, the whole operation seems really about sort of wiping out Ukraine from the earth. So can anyone speak to that?
I'll just jump in here. Let's distinguish between Putin and everything else. Everything that's been said about Putin is absolutely accurate, but I think the question is, to what degree do other Russians share this vision? And I think that's really where the answer to the first question, is there any potential for peace? I think if Putin is removed from power, that's a game changer. Because I don't know that very many people in Russia share that vision that he is selling. So that's, I mean, as a historian, people within Hitler's inner circle tried to eliminate him. And we've heard all these fantasy novels about them succeeding, but that I think would be a solution if the leader is removed, either by the elite or some assassin, although that could be going into sort of fantasy.
Yeah. What about the, I mean, maybe this is a noble question, Frank's question about sort of whether, there'll be an attack on Lviv. It's clearly perceived as the center of Ukrainian nationalism. Anybody speak to that? Or
well, I don't actually think Lviv is perceived only as a center of nationalism. Technically speaking, if we look at social surveys, the most nationalistic population is elsewhere. I'm not going to name where they are for the purposes of not giving anyone any ideas, but it wouldn't be necessarily that. I think Putin in his speech told us he thinks Lviv is Polish, right? So I think that's he might even leave it to the Poles to reclaim, as he suggested in his speech. But I think here we need to be very careful, and I expect all-out war across the whole territory of Ukraine, according to the plans that were made available to us, that were repeatedly shared with us. And I don't actually know what I would expect beyond that. But I think we do need to consider what are the off-ramps, and not maybe for Putin himself, but exactly for what Marta referred to, for other people in the Kremlin, for other people in government, and for the Russian people. They also there will need to be at some point a way, if it's a future without Putin, then there will need to be a way to make that work. So there are people thinking about this, right? There are people thinking about the Russian population. And I think here it's really worthwhile reflecting on two really important studies. One is the Russian election survey collected by Bryn Rosenfeld and her colleagues. It used to be based at Harvard, George Washington University, now Cornell. And back in December, as late as very late December, in fact, they found that only 8% of the population of Russia supported any aggressive action towards Ukraine. We now have seen state statistics that show a much higher number of not the support for invasion or war, because you can't actually ask that question because there is no invasion or war happening, but do people support the military action? And we have fairly high numbers up into the 60s, right, that support this. But what is to blame here? And this goes back to the importance of media and communicating with our Russian colleagues and friends as well, and not losing those contacts, I think. Because Paul Good has done a discourse analysis of what happened in the week and a half leading up to February 24th. And in that week and a half, there was an onslaught of media coverage of fake, for the most part, news stories about genocide in Donbass and the like. And this is what managed to create a rally around the flag effect that we haven't seen in Russia in a very long time. So beyond just thinking about the inner circle who can be a challenger politically in the elite circles in Russia, we also need to think how to communicate with the general Russian population if our normal media channels are not available to us. So I would actually encourage everyone who is watching, who knows someone in Russia, to keep in touch with them. In fact, President Zelensky said this: call your friend, even if you were fighting since 2014, tell them about the truth of what's actually happening, because it might be that even though they don't like to hear it coming from you, it will make a difference.
Yeah, well, actually, thank you, Olga. This actually speaks to a kind of very actuality question, which is there's a debate here about to what extent, should we sort of, Western universities boycott all Russian universities, or sort of only certain ones, like Higher School of Economics, which is clearly led by a Putin supporter, or should we not boycott any university? I mean, I personally, I can sort of see both sides. I mean, I can certainly understand why, if we're boycotting, Russian soccer and stuff, why not universities? But I also understand that, Russian universities are oftentimes the site of some of the most important opposition, and also because, as you mentioned, that communication is so key and will be key if we're going to, resolve this conflict. Can anybody speak to that? I mean, should we have a kind of a general boycott of all Russian universities, or what do you guys?
Can I just jump in there, because I'm
Yeah.
going to be speaking with people from Shirk right after this meeting. My view is the enemy is people who support Putin. And all my friends in Russia are out there protesting and posting at great personal risk. They are not the enemy, and they need to be supported. So I am opposed to any sort of blanket bans on universities and intellectuals. But that said, there are a lot of academics who are Putin supporters. So I think it's really important for us to be very selective in our response. And the measuring stick has to be, are you a Putin supporter or not? Because people like my friends, we can't ban them. We need to help them. But those people, those academics who are, parroting Putin's rhetoric, those people we don't want to have anything to do with, and they should be banned. That's my view.
Thanks. Tatiana, can you speak to
that? I wanted to say the Lviv Center for Urban History. So some of you know this institution. It's a kind of small private institute, but very, very active also in public. debates, and they issued an open letter on this, asking to boycott Russian academia, but it was formulated very carefully, so to boycott institutions and people cooperating with the regime and funded by the Russian state, and I think it's a very good example how one can be careful in this very, of course, very tricky issue, because in the social networks there is a kind of ongoing war now, unfortunately, between all kind of people who are against Putin, but then you have some groups claiming this victim status for themselves, and so you have some Russian liberals saying, okay, but we are also victims of Putin. You are dying, you are attacking Ukraine, and we go to protest. We are beaten by the police, and we are put in arrested, and so on. And then Ukrainians start, arguing with them, getting very angry and saying, but it's a different thing if you protest in Moscow and just get arrested, or you are bombed and you protest with you actually go against the Russian tanks just with a Ukrainian flag, and this kind of course it's very, in a way, very destructive and very untimely conflict, but people are just so, I think it's a lot of emotions now, and among and between the Russian and Ukrainian colleagues and Western colleagues of Ukrainian and Russian origins, and so it's at the moment very difficult.
Thank you. I actually wanted to sort of touch a
Lucan,
little.
can I just jump on this,
Please,
on this point, just very briefly? I think, to my mind, I mean, I see obviously kind of the two sides, some dilemma there. First of all, I'd definitely second what Tatiana just said. I think we shouldn't be drawing equivalency in any way between, Ukrainian people who are being bombed and hiding there for their lives, right? And Russians who are protesting. Yes, they're victims too, but I don't think that's the equivalent. I think that should be very clear. And I think on the cooperation, I mean, to my mind, I think there is a difference between institutional cooperation and individual cooperation, right? Because if you're talking about, say, MGIMO, Moscow Institute of International Affairs, right, which is an institute of the foreign ministry, it's an arm of the foreign ministry. They've been the ones spewing all this propaganda, essentially supporting this invasion, right? To my mind, there is no justification of keeping cooperation at an institutional level with this outfit, right? Now, that is not to say that people in the MGIMO who have spoken against the aggression, there were a lot of students and I think very few faculty, right, that they shouldn't get, say, a forum, to speak or, be invited to Western universities and so forth. So this sort of like institutional as opposed to individual cooperation, right? And I'm, not involved in university bureaucracy in any way, but I imagine that, there are some sort of, certain cogs already turning and it's easy and so forth. Maybe there has to be rethinking, right? Like, yeah, maybe you have some sort of nice system going, and now that system would need to be undone and something else would need to be put in its place. So the Russian voices, that still get, access, they can still be heard, but it's no longer going through the department, of whatever international affairs of that institution, right? And I think certainly taking money from these institutions for joint projects is very problematic. So to me, sort of that's a distinction there as well.
Very good. Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah. Volodymyr.
Yeah. Very quickly. I think that question is very good for Western academic discussion, but it's a bit abstract. I mean, I understand that my colleagues in the West should need a decision being made, and it's more of a decision, and that's understandable. But in terms of helping Ukraine right now, it wouldn't help much, any of those letters, or ignoring or boycotting Russian colleagues. What would help Ukraine, financially, and refugees, and sending weapons, because already we're having these javelins and everything, and you see tank columns are burning, and then if we get Stingers, then maybe they couldn't use helicopters to land the paratroopers closer to Odessa. That's what matters. If we can stop Putin militarily at the battlefield, that would be the only way to stop him. I don't place any hopes at all at either some kind of a coup, palace coup, or maybe bigger public uprising in Russia. I don't think any of those are going to happen. But if they run out of steam, out of bullets, out of soldiers to send into Ukraine, if every Ukrainian would have a javelin on their shoulder, or all right, and any man here would. That would actually change the situation very much. So still asymmetric conflict, still they have upper hand, but they're going to pay even higher price. And through the 7 first days, they've paid already such a huge price. They wanted to do it in 2 or 3 days. They already 7 days, and they only taken Kherson, and it's not a major city. It's a great Ukrainian city, not a major one. So if you just increase pressure on those accounts, and the West can do it, that is much more important than boycotting Gimor or Higher School of Economics, something like that. That's my position. Thank you.
So I mean, maybe we'll just speak to that, and this will kind of have to wrap it up because we only have 5 more minutes left. I don't want to leave my children in the schoolyard. But what do people think about the efficacy of the Western responses, or more that we could or should be doing, or?
Can I just jump in here because it ties into what Volodymyr has said? I couldn't agree more. We need to focus our attention on the things that are absolutely most important. And everyone in on this call and many people watching us right now are people that are very powerful with their voice. They're very capable, and they can pick up the phone and call politicians. They can take meetings. They can push things. And I think here, use that privilege and power to the right means. So if it means writing your politicians to help manage a humanitarian corridor, with some academics here in the UK and in France particularly have been doing, because we've identified the Macron government as the most capable in pushing Putin to make that happen, then that's what you do. If you are capable of reaching out to various ministers or MPs that can change visa policy restrictions, which we are working on right now in the United Kingdom with both the Home Secretary and the Shadow Secretary. But these are the things that we can do. And I think, and obviously lobbying our governments to send more military aid to Ukraine that Volodymyr highlighted. Lastly, and I know the administration in Kyiv wants us to do this, they want us to push for more sanctions on oligarchs, the people that work with them, their family members, their extended family members. There are far too many of these individuals that are not only completely untouched by the sanctions, but they are living very comfortable lives, be it in London or in the Netherlands or elsewhere. And they are able to now actually sell off some of their assets and put it in offshore accounts that are not going to be touched by the sanctions. This is where we can all be pressuring our governments, because this is something our governments can be doing right now.
Thank you. And I just would say, I think anybody else want to speak to that? But I think that, at some level, I hear Volodymyr that, some of these, like even the sanctions, somewhat seem sort of long-term solutions when we really have the immediate crisis. And it seems like weapons and humanitarian assistance is probably, I don't know if anybody would disagree, really should be the focus, because if the Ukraine army falls, then, all of this is almost, to naught. And so that, is what we have to avoid above all.
If you lose Ukraine within days, there'll be no one to help here.
Absolutely, that's extremely well said.
So yes, it's a matter of us. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much to Volodymyr, Marta, Olga, Oxana, Tatiana. The Center for European Russian Eurasian Studies, we're holding 2 events every week. We'll be sending out notices of them. So we're, this is a crisis that's, that's very important to us. And I hope to see many of you again soon. Thank you very much.